Okay, I'm going to try to do all these chapters in a really fast period of time, so if you need to pause it, please do. The first one is about the Spanish-American War. So the Spanish-American War was caused by a U.S. conflict with Spain over Cuba. However, it was really caused, one of the main reasons behind it was a growing conflict inside the United States. Labor unrest, farmer unrest, immigrant unrest, wealthy versus poor. There was just a very high level of conflict in the United States. And one way to sort of relieve that conflict was find ways for the United States to grow in its power and in its markets, places it could sell things. And so there became a desire to make the U.S. a world power. That's the key words to the Spanish-American War. The war made the United States a world power and gave Americans the sense that their country was one of the most important in the world. And it helped alleviate some of the conflict inside when America was able to offer its products across the seas to other countries easier. And it also sort of grew the ranks of the U.S. military and just made the U.S. a stronger country in the world. This slide is about mostly the big sister policy. The U.S. definitely during the Spanish-American War had its eyes set on Latin America, the Caribbean and Central America, Northern, Southern America, like Colombia, Panama, Cuba, DR, Mexico. The U.S. had a big sister attitude and pursued the policy called the big sister policy. The big sister policy basically said that the countries of Latin America are the U.S.'s little siblings. They should look to us for guidance, they should look to us for protection, they should look to us for help, and they should expect us to sort of tell them what to do if there's a problem. Skip that slide. So, the details of the Spanish-American War. Inside of Cuba, there was unrest. Spain had controlled Cuba, of course, since the days of Columbus, and many people inside Cuba wanted Spain to go, and the U.S. wanted Spain to go. The U.S. wanted to get control of the Spanish sugar production, and Spain was just a problem. So there was a group of people in Spain called in Cuba called Los Insurrectos who wanted to kick Spain out and make Cuba its own free country. The U.S. did not want to see Spain or Cuba fall into a mess, and they wanted to see Spain go. So the U.S. began to support these insurrectos and began to basically tell Spain that Cuba was America's. We weren't going to take it over and make it a state or anything, but that the United States regarded Cuba as its interest and not the interest of Spain. And the U.S. and Spain started to have a little bit of a conflict because, of course, Cuba had been part of Spain, Spanish control for many, many years. There was a lot of bad things happening in Cuba, and eventually this whole incident with the USS Maine occurred. The USS Maine was a ship that was sent to Cuba by the United States to protect American interests. That ship blew up. The Spanish blamed it on an accident. The U.S. blamed it on Spain and said Spain deliberately blew up that ship, which probably wasn't true. However, Spain got blamed. There was this whole rallying cry, "Remember the Maine," which was what Americans said to give them inspiration to fight the war. We want to remember the people who died on the ship, even though it was probably an accident. So that was the thing that pushed America into war with Spain. The war effort was greatly helped by the yellow journalism of American newspapers, this exaggeration of everything. Spain was made to look like a horrible, awful country. The problems that the people in Cuba experienced as a result of Spanish rule were exaggerated, and yellow journalism sold a lot of newspapers for newspaper companies, but it wasn't always true. This is what the U.S. wanted from Spain. They wanted an end to those reconcentration camps, which Spain had been putting people in Cuba into concentration camps to oppose them. McKinley did not want this war, but he got pressured into it. The United States promised Cuba that we would let them be independent once we got rid of Spain. That was sort of true. We sort of kept that promise, but sort of didn't. In the course of the Spanish-American War, Spain was weak. Their military was weak. It was old. It was out of date. The United States had a much better navy, a much better fighting force, and the U.S. just started to take countries from Spain, take things from the Spanish Empire. So the Philippines, even though it's really far away, the Philippines was taken by the United States from Spain. Also Puerto Rico, Cuba, of course, eventually was freed of Spanish rule. This is what really made the U.S. an imperialistic power. It made the U.S. Stretch from all the way around the world, as the next slide shows. And U.S. power was dominant in the Western Hemisphere now, and all the way from the Philippines to Puerto Rico, basically. The war was easily won by the United States. During this war, Teddy Roosevelt went with those Rough Riders and personally helped kick the Spanish out of Spain, kick the Spanish out of Cuba, I'm sorry, and that made him pretty famous. During the course of the Spanish-American War, before and after, the U.S. also had its eyes set on Asia. The U.S. didn't want to fight in Asia or take over Asia. However, it wanted to start establishing connections with Asian countries. Commodore Perry went to Japan. The United States pushed this idea of an open door policy with China, the idea that China should be open to trade with any country in the world and not just Britain. The British kind of wanted to keep China under their control. The U.S. resisted that. The U.S. also took Hawaii. Hawaii was its own country, but we were worried the Japanese might snatch it up. So the U.S. took Hawaii, not as part of the Spanish-American War, but sort of in that time period. The DR, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. So in the end, Cuba was freed from Spanish rule. It was its own country. However, the Platt Amendment, the U.S. Platt Amendment, gave the U.S. the right to intervene there. The U.S. gave itself the right to intervene in Cuba whenever it wanted to. We established a naval base there, Guantanamo Bay, which is still there. This idea of people, for the first time since the United States is going outside of our borders, taking over other countries, this idea of, does the Constitution go with it? When America takes over another area, does all the rights and protections of the Constitution immediately apply? And the Supreme Court said no. The flag outruns the Constitution. So the flag is put there. Yes, this is controlled by America, but the constitutional protections don't follow right away. The Roosevelt corollary, the Monroe Doctrines on every regents, practically. The U.S. said that we would pay the debts of Caribbean countries. So basically the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine says that the Caribbean is America's zone. We control it. It's our area. Sure, DR and Cuba are their own independent countries, but any European country, especially with a problem with, say, DR or Puerto Rico, needs to talk to America first. This is an American zone of power, and other countries need to stay out, even if we don't directly control all the countries there. Okay, skip all that. And then let's go to chapter 27. Let's go to 28. So 28 is about the progressives. The progressives are born out of the Greenback Labor Party, and especially the populists. The populists were the farmers who were so unhappy with everything in the late 19th century. The progressives were born from them. Okay, William Jennings Bryan was a famous progressive who ran for president many times but lost every time. Basically, this slide summarizes what progressives wanted. They were against laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire capitalism is where the government just lets things ride. Just let it happen how it happens, that's it. The government should not try to control the economy, let businesses do what they're going to do, and progressives were against that. They felt that capitalism out of control would only hurt poor people, and that the government needed to do certain things, this things here, to protect people's rights and make the country better. They felt the government should work to help people and not simply sit and do only basic things, which is what Republicans at the time sort of felt the government should do. So these are all things that progressives wanted to accomplish. This slide just summarizes that again. Study it. All right. Progressives were very much fueled by women. Women were very important to the progressive movement. They, of course, were fighting for their own rights with the right to vote. They were fighting for the rights of women killed in working accidents, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City, where all the women died because the doors were locked. It was completely unsafe. So progressives wanted there to be new workplace safety laws so that, like, buildings had rules about about safety, and people couldn't work in unsafe environments. They want the government to make these laws. Many of them were against alcohol and the consumption of alcohol. Women educated themselves about how bad things were in America, and some proposals to make it better. These cases you can read for AP. Muckrakers, of course, are people journalists, writers, photographers, who exposed wrong in American society. They basically showed everybody what the real deal was, and worked to expose the social problems. So they showed, for example, Upton Sinclair showed how the meat in America was gross and nasty and unsafe. There were books about like how politicians were all taking money and corrupt. The Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in response to the fact that so many foods and medications were unsafe. The progressives wanted all of these things, and the muckrakers simply showed what was wrong to everybody, and then the progressive proposed solutions to fix it. The election reforms have to do with progressives wanted to bring more people into the political process. They wanted more people to be able to participate in what was happening in the government. So referendums, recalls, initiatives, secret ballot are all different ways where you can have an increase in citizen participation. For example, referendums allow people directly to vote on laws instead of having only the representatives in state capitals vote on laws. There was a lot of corruption in cities, and this talks a little bit about some of the corruption. We've already talked about Boss Tweed and different ways that cities tried to make things better. This just summarizes a lot of the major muckrakers and major sort of progressive people at the time. Jane Addams, who helped a lot of urban poor immigrants. Margaret Sanger, who worked for women's rights, especially women's reproductive rights. Thomas Nast made all these cartoons that showed how corrupt the government was, particularly Boss Tweed. Jacob Riis took the photos of poor kids mostly, but just poor, nasty areas of New York that a lot of rich people didn't see, how the other half lives, meaning the other half of the country that wasn't rich. In reality, of course, it wasn't half. The overwhelming majority of people weren't rich. Upton Sinclair with the meat. Ida Tarbell with big business corruption and big business lies. Lincoln Steffens with city government corruption. Frank Norris with suffering at the hands of business. Basically, all of them can be tied together, is that they all exposed and showed how people without power in America were getting screwed by the rich, wealthy, and powerful. Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is important because he is a Republican president, but he eventually leaves the Republican Party because he is trying to get progressive laws passed. Teddy Roosevelt believed that the presidency and therefore the government should be strong, and it should do things that help the people. Okay, he promoted, for example, the Square Deal. The Square Deal said the government should work to be fair to everyone, and the government should make sure that the country is fair for everyone. That was not something that most Republican presidents wanted to do. He proposed the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine we talked about. He would break up trusts that were bad. So, for example, the Standard Oil Trust. J.D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company did all kinds of bad, terrible things. And their goal was to crush competition so that the only oil company in America was Standard Oil, owned by J.D. Rockefeller. They saw no reason why other companies should not be crushed. He broke that company up. That's not something a Republican at the time would do. Laissez-faire said just leave companies alone. Let them do what they're going to do. The strong ones will make it, the weak ones won't. He didn't believe in that. He broke up trusts that were bad, but he left trusts that he felt were good alone. He advocated the walk softly, carry a big stick in Central and Latin America, which basically means the government of the United States would not interfere directly in the affairs of Central and Latin American countries, but if there was a problem, we would use the big stick, like the U.S. would regulate. All of these amendments are things that are considered progressive things, progressive actions that were passed. So the federal income tax is something that is the tax based on how much money you make. That's very progressive. Okay, if richer people are paying a higher percentage of taxes and poor people are paying less, if any, that's very progressive. It helps poor people out. The amendment of direct election of senators. Every state has 2 senators. Before this amendment, those 2 senators were picked by the state legislature, the people in Albany or whatever the state capital is who make laws, not by the people directly. That's not very progressive, so they passed a law where the people directly elect those senators. Prohibition. They got alcohol to be illegal. We'll talk more about that in the next chapters. Women, the right to vote. We'll talk more about that too. The Federal Reserve Act, they got not a national bank, but they got like a system of regulating the economy and money that was much more powerful than had existed for many years. The government simply got bigger, stronger, and more active in the lives of Americans. President Roosevelt, of course, believed in conservation, protecting the environment. He was the president called Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy, named after the bear, or the bear was called that because President Roosevelt was such a nature lover, and he set aside all of his land to be protected from development. Skip that. All right, chapter 29, the U.S. and World War I. So in 1912, an interesting election. The Republican is William Howard Taft. Taft was elected president after Roosevelt. So Roosevelt did not run for president a second time because he had already served most of McKinley's term. He served his own term, and he felt that that was enough. And so he left, and he personally believed that William Howard Taft would be a good president. Well, William Howard Taft did not turn out to be the president that Roosevelt would have liked him to be. And so in 1912, Roosevelt came back, and he ran against Taft as a progressive. That means they have a Republican, a progressive, and a Democrat, which means the Democrats won because the Democrats were united. The Republicans were split between Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Taft isn't a president you need to study very much other than the dollar diplomacy, which is the idea that the U.S. didn't need to control every country with a military or threats of the Navy or Army, that we could simply put a lot of money into countries, and taking that money out was enough of a threat to give the United States power. That's called dollar diplomacy. U.S. companies put money into Latin American countries and therefore have a lot of power through our money and not through the military necessarily. So in this election, the Democrat Woodrow Wilson wins. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat from the South. Even though he is governor of New Jersey and president of Princeton University, he ultimately was born and raised in Southern society, and so that influenced him a lot. However, he's a hybrid. He's Southern, but he also believed the federal government should do things to help people, like New Freedom is basically a plan to solve problems with industrialization in America. These are problems like poverty, like pollution, just all the problems of more and more factories. And he had a plan called New Freedom to solve that. Teddy Roosevelt called it New Nationalism. He wanted to regulate big businesses. So President Wilson was kind of a progressive president, but personally he was super racist. What else did he do? These are some things. The Federal Reserve Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act broke up trusts, just like the Sherman Antitrust Act. The first president to give the State of the Union address live, in person, and not just on paper. So in President Wilson's term, one of the things that happened, of course, was World War I. That's sort of in his second term. He was elected in 1912. The war broke out in 1914, but the U.S. didn't get involved until 1917. You already know from Global why the war broke out. All these alliances and nationalism and different countries in Europe trying to be the big dog, the big powerful country. That was the problem in Europe, but most Americans just wanted to stay neutral and stay out of it. In fact, that was President Wilson's policy. The U.S. should stay out of the affair. However, most Americans leaned towards Britain. It was basically, World War I was basically Britain versus Germany. There were other countries involved, of course, and they were major: France, Austria, Hungary. However, Britain versus Germany is how a lot of Americans saw it. And most Americans were on Britain's side, except for the very large number of Americans who were descended from German backgrounds. So the U.S. had like a pro-British attitude. So there's a lot of portraying the Germans as devils and evil. And America, of course, looked at the war and thought, we don't want to get in it, but we'd love to make money off of it. So selling guns and stuff to the British, maybe even the Germans, the French, whoever, would make the U.S. a lot of money. So, for example, J.P. Morgan sent $2.3 billion to the British and the French. That gave them a lot of money. However, the Germans looked at this and kind of felt like America and its rich people were on the side of Britain. And so they started attacking any ship from America that they thought had weapons from America for Britain. And they started to sink these ships in the Atlantic with their new submarine boats. Unterseeboot means submarine, under the sea boat. And the conflict started to sink a lot of American ships, and Americans resented that, and they started to get really angry at the Germans. So Teddy Roosevelt was angry, the Germans were angry, and it just became more and more of a problem. President Wilson tried to keep the country out of war. He promised to keep the country out of war, but when the Germans just kept sinking ships with their submarines, a lot of people just pushed President Wilson to want to declare war on Germany. In 1916, there's another election, because elections are never canceled, and President Wilson was reelected, but he still hoped that there would be peace. He wasn't reelected on the idea that he would get the U.S. into the war. Most Americans still in 1916 thought that the U.S. could avoid the war. All right, last chapter on here, chapter 30. Oh no, I gotta pull it up real quickly. Chapter 30 is World War One. We did that in class today. It shouldn't take me very long. 1 second. World War One in the United States. So in World War I, the U.S. gets into it because of unrestricted German sinking of our ships. Unrestricted German submarine warfare. That's the main thing. However, there's also the Zimmerman note. The Germans sent this note, the secret note to Mexico, that said if Mexico would attack the United States, they would help them. Germans were just trying to be tricky to get Mexico to attack so that the U.S. would be preoccupied with a war with Mexico and have no time to continue to help the British. This is just a summary of everything. Study this slide. It's basically more about World War I in Europe and how it got started, and summarizes everything. Not everyone wanted to fight this war. There were people against World War I. There were people who felt the U.S. should never have gotten involved with it. Number one, a lot of German background people in America did not want to fight Germany, and they felt like this war was stupid. That was one group. Other people felt the U.S. simply was being imperialistic again, getting involved with problems all the way across the sea, looking to take advantage of other countries. This was no good. Wilson tried to package the war as a fight to save democracy, make the world safe for democracy, and at the end of the war, he said these 14 things would happen that would make the world free from war forever. There would be this League of Nations, there would be free trade between countries, open agreements, democracy. President Wilson really truly felt that somehow this war would be the last war in all of the world's history. Of course it wasn't. World War II breaks out 20 years later. But he really tried to push this on the American people, that this war was about making the world safe for democracy and peaceful and wonderful, and that this is what America was fighting for, not because of German submarines. There was a lot of propaganda. The Committee on Public Information put a lot of signs out and stuff on the radio, and just started to really push this idea that America was fighting this war. It was a good war. It was like practically what God wanted. It was just a great war, and no one should be against it. Not everyone bought it, and people were against it, and they protested against this war, and they protested against what was happening, and they were silenced by the Espionage Act and Sedition Act of 1917 and 18. These laws basically made it illegal to do anything disloyal or abusive against the United States government or the flag. And so basically it stopped First Amendment rights. It was okay. The First Amendment is designed for people to be able to say what they think. And people should be able to say they don't support a war. But this law has made it basically illegal to say that you don't support the war, that you're against the president. And a lot of people were arrested. It's regarded as a bad law, a law that stopped freedom of speech, and it's something not to be repeated. There was this case, Schenck versus the United States, during the course of this war. This man was passing out signs, little pamphlets telling people not to sign up for the draft, don't go off to war, and he got arrested, and he lost, but this idea of clear and present danger came out. The Supreme Court basically said it's okay for the government to make certain things illegal to say if there's a clear and present danger to the country. And they felt that the clear and present danger of people not signing up, not joining the military, not responding to the draft, was enough to arrest people. Now today, I don't think most Supreme Court justices would agree. However, at the time, that was held as constitutional. This is still an important case to understand that free speech does have its limits. You can't literally say whatever you want. There are limits, and if there's a war on, there tends to be even more limits to free speech. Okay, the U.S. in World War I, I already talked about those amendments or those laws, the Espionage and Sedition Act and Schenck. There was a lot of nativist fear during this war. People were afraid of immigrants, especially Italians, Germans, Russians. There was this fear that communism was going to spread throughout the world, that anything you say might be useful to the enemy. There was just a lot of fear. Skip that. The United States, when we went to war, America threw its all into it. Okay, the government got involved with planning the economy. So factories that used to make guns for hunting started to make guns for war. Boots for fishing turned into boots for war. The government really stepped in to regulate the economy to make the war happen. People were encouraged to buy Liberty bonds, which are loans you give the government for the war that would be paid back later. People had these victory gardens where they grew food for themselves so that the food that was grown by farmers could be sent for the war. Didn't turn their lights on Tuesday, didn't turn the heat on Monday to save energy for the war. Alcohol became even more unpopular because Germany is a very strong beer country, and people didn't want to be associated with that. American soldiers went to Europe and didn't do much until the very end of the war. There were a lot of little rendezvous with French women, etc. They were mostly backup at first. 1917, of course, Russia became communist. America hated that. It was the start of the U.S.-Russian problems. America, these are battles on the regions. They don't talk about these much. The U.S. didn't participate in many battles, but eventually it did. This beach battle at Château-Thierry in France was the first time that the U.S. Ever fought a war on European soil instead of Europe fighting in America. The U.S. did help the British and the French win the war, but it was really late in the war. Okay, it's not fair to say that the U.S. saved Britain and France and they were going to lose. They probably weren't going to lose. The U.S. just helped make it maybe come a little faster. The war ended at the 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, so that's why November 11th is Veterans Day in 1918. The U.S. lost very few soldiers, but millions were killed in Europe. In reality, the flu, this horrible, awful flu pandemic, killed more people in the world than that war. The flu ravaged the world. Skip. Wilson's 14 points. Of course, Wilson did not get the League of Nations passed. The League of Nations was going to be this big union of countries around the world that would discuss problems and work them out before a war could happen, and he could not get Americans to want to agree to that. We just want to stay out of it. Go back to normal and just stay out of this. America became isolation.